Enabling a Better Tomorrow, Model Interactions. Continuing on with the understanding aspect of enabling a better tomorrow, as we do analysis and synthesis and identify the interacting components, trying to understand that set of interactions that are part of the all of the possible interactions that are actually relevant to the situation we're trying to understand, it's appropriate to build a model of that set of interactions so that you can keep track of things. Now, some people tell me that they can read paragraphs and paragraphs of text and keep in their mind all of the interactions that are described in that text, and I'm sorry, it just seems to be beyond me, because if I'm going to get a sense of what the influences are that are responsible for the pattern of behavior in the situation the way it is, I need a picture. I need something that shows me the set of influences that come together to produce that result. Now, and at times I get the sense that developing a model is an unnatural act for most people. It seems as though that the idea of picking up a piece of paper and writing down A and B and drawing a line between the two of them is just way too difficult. Though, so thinking about this for ages and ages and trying to figure out. I mean, there are lots of different ways that one can develop diagrams. There are lots of different names for diagrams and diagram methods. And I have a preference for something that's actually called causal loop diagrams, though I don't care what one calls them. What I want is a way to get a sense of what the relationships are that are at play to actually create the situation that I'm trying to figure out how to deal with. Because it's that set of interactions that I have to figure out how to change. So what I've done over time is sort of figure out how to distill the approach to developing a diagram down to an approach as simple as I can get it. And as I said in a previous video, from a Sufi saying that because you understand one, you think you understand two, because one and one is two, but first you have to understand and. So I've developed an approach to diagramming which has one word, and the word is and. So I begin with whatever the situation is that I'm trying to understand. And here, for this example, I have crop-eating insects which are causing crop damage. And it's that situation that I want to understand. So for each node in the current existing situation, I simply ask, and what does this influence, and what influences this? And I do that for the crop damage, and I do it for crop-eating insects. Where you start is not as important as actually starting, because if you continue to ask the same question in a sensible way, you'll end up with the same kind of model when you get done sooner or later. So if I have crop-eating insects leading to crop damage, and what does that influence? Well, from historical perspective, what it encourages, because of historical learning, is that the crop damage encourages me to apply pesticides, because I know that applying pesticides kills the crop-eating insects. And I end up with what's referred to as a balancing loop, because this is a positive reinforcing influence, so that more crop-eating insects would lead to more crop damage, and more crop damage would influence me to apply more pesticides. Though applying pesticides tends to reduce the number of crop-eating insects. So in some diagrams you see these as referred to with S's and O's, or pluses and minuses. I just use blue for positives and reds for balancing, because it's, I don't know, it's a personal preference. So when I walk around this loop, I said it's a balancing loop because if I walk around the balancing loop, I have an odd number of balancing influences. And anytime you have an odd number of balancing influences, it's a balancing loop. If it's an even number, it's a reinforcing loop, and there'll be some of those shortly to follow. So now that I've developed this insect control loop, even though I apply pesticides to kill insects, I find out that year after year I still have to spray, I have to apply more and more pesticides to deal with the insects. So why is it that that's happening, being that I'm applying pesticides to kill the insects? How come they're not gone? So what else is it that's happening within the structure? Looking at, well, what does this influence or what does this influence? And the next thing that comes to mind is that, well, crop-eating insects have insect births. The more insects, the more births, and the more births, the more insects. So there are no balancing influences in this loop. So it's a reinforcing loop, which results in a growing population of insects. The difficulty is that I don't actually end up killing all of the insects, and the insects multiply rapidly so that there are more and more insects on an ongoing basis. Though, is that really enough to account for the situation that I'm experiencing? So I continue to look at the elements and ask myself, and what else is in play? And I realize that applying pesticides tends to promote pesticide immunity, which results in more insects, which leads to more crop damage, which encourages me to apply more pesticides, which promotes more pesticide immunity. There are no balancing influences, so I have another reinforcing loop called pesticide immunity, and this loop is taking me in the absolute opposite direction that I want to go. So that I am, in fact, following the quote from Pogo, I have met the enemy and he is me. Because I am doing something that specifically moves the situation in a direction that I don't want to go. Though, even though I've identified that, are there other things that are also relevant to the situation? And when I apply pesticides, what else does it influence? Or what influences it? Well, if I look at it, I realize that before I planted my crops, before I started to apply pesticides, there wasn't a crop-eating insect problem. When I apply pesticides, it tends to kill the controlling insects that used to devour the crop-eating insects. So I apply pesticides, which kills controlling insects, which reduces the number of crop-eating insects, which leads to crop damage, which encourages me to spray more. I have two balancing influences in this loop, which means it's also a reinforcing loop, which is a predator destruction loop, and it's taking me also in the absolute opposite direction that I want to go. And so if I bring the other pieces back, the model now looks like this. Is the model complete? I don't know. Depends upon what I need to understand to deal with the situation at hand, which is I have crop-eating insects causing crop damage. I should also ask about, excuse me, that were I to stop applying pesticides and promote the development of controlling insects, would they in fact manage the population of crop-eating insects so that I wouldn't have to apply pesticides? And if I developed the controlling insects and they ate all the crop-eating insects, well, what would they eat next? And if I didn't do that, if I just continued to apply pesticides, how long would it be before I actually polluted the land to such an extent that it wouldn't grow anything anymore, or the runoff destroyed my own water supply and I had to import water? And I mean, there's just an endless array of influences that might be relevant. Whether or not they belong in the model is a question, depends upon whether or not you determine if they're relevant to the situation you're trying to deal with. And as I said before, you develop this model and you continue to say, okay, and this influences what else, and what else influences this. And when you get to a point where you run out of things you identify, you can do research, and then you go and find other people and you explain the model to them. And more often than not, they will have some additional pieces that you simply didn't think of. And you then evaluate those pieces to determine whether or not they ought to be part of the model. So this is called a causal loop diagram. I call it an influence diagram. Without a diagram of this type, I simply can't keep track of all of the pieces that are part of the puzzle, that give me a perspective of what all the interacting pieces are that have to be taken into consideration. And after developing these for years and years and years and years, I still never get them right the first time. I draw them, I add pieces, I throw pieces away, I wad up the paper and throw the paper away and start over again. Though it's sort of, after a while, you sort of get it sorted out, and it's a trial and learning experience. Not trial and error, trial and learning. And when you finally learn enough, then the model makes sense, and all of a sudden it provides an insight and you understand. So developing models is essential to promoting the understanding that's necessary to develop as a foundation for the strategy that needs to be developed to deal with the situation. And we'll talk more about additional pieces in the next video. Take care. Bye.